The air inside the courthouse was tense, filled with whispers and curious eyes as the tall figure of the tomb guard was led in through the heavy wooden doors. His hands were bound tightly in cold steel cuffs, the metallic clinking echoing with each step he took across the marble floor. People inside the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, some out of disbelief and others out of quiet outrage, because everyone knew that tomb guards were not ordinary men. They were symbols of honor, discipline, and unshakable loyalty to their duty, protectors of sacred tradition, and men who stood vigil rain or shine, day or night, even in silence, guarding what others could never truly understand. Yet here stood one of them, shackled like a criminal, his uniform neat despite the rough treatment, his eyes steady even as officers tugged at his arm to hurry him forward. The judge at the bench leaned back smugly in his chair, glancing at the soldier with an expression that carried no respect, only contempt, as if the sacred oaths and sacrifices of this man were nothing more than a costume in his courtroom. Murmurs rippled among the crowd, some spectators outraged at the insult, others watching with morbid fascination, wondering what sort of mistake or offense could possibly bring such a man before the law. The tomb guard did not speak, his jaw locked, his dignity preserved even under humiliation, but every person who knew of his service understood that this scene was far more shameful for the system than for him. It was not just a soldier on trial, it was the very idea of respect for service being mocked, and no one could yet predict what storm this insult was about to unleash. The officers who cuffed him looked uneasy themselves, for even they could feel that what they were doing was wrong. They had dragged him from his post without explanation, responding only to orders barked down from men who valued authority more than justice. As they tightened the chains around his wrists, the guard had not resisted, not out of weakness but out of discipline. His training taught him endurance, silence, and above all, respect for the law even when the law failed him. But the silence of the tomb guard carried its own weight, and as the courtroom filled with restless energy, people realized that his quiet presence spoke louder than words. The prosecutor rose with arrogance, papers in hand, prepared to deliver a speech about disobedience and defiance of authority, accusing the guard of refusing commands outside of his duty. His voice dripped with scorn, painting the soldier as stubborn and uncooperative, but those who truly knew the sacred traditions of the tomb guard understood the truth. These men could not abandon their post for any worldly order, not even from powerful officials. Their oath was above politics, and their honor was bound to something eternal. The judge smirked as the prosecutor spoke, clearly relishing the moment, but the unease in the room grew thicker. People shifted in their seats, some bowing their heads in quiet shame, because they knew that this trial was not about justice, it was about pride, ego, and an attempt to break the unbreakable. And though the guard stood silent, there was something in his eyes that promised this humiliation would not be the end of the story. Outside the courthouse, word spread quickly that a tomb guard had been cuffed and brought in like a criminal. Veterans gathered in disbelief, ordinary citizens shook their heads in anger, and whispers reached the ears of those in command who had once trained, fought, and bled with soldiers like him. Among them was a man who had earned his reputation through battles of discipline and character, a colonel who had once stood at the very top of military honor, respected even by those above him. When news reached his office, he did not waste a moment. He knew the weight of the insult, not only to the man but to the uniform itself. For a soldier bound by sacred oath, being treated like a criminal was not just a personal humiliation, it was a dishonor to the entire chain of service. The colonel, stern-faced and unshaken, set his cap firmly on his head and strode toward the courthouse with a stride that carried authority no judge could imitate. Those who saw him enter did not need an announcement to know that someone of true power had arrived. Inside, as the prosecutor continued to spit accusations, the doors opened with a sudden force, and silence fell over the room as the colonel stepped in, his presence commanding instant respect. His uniform bore medals of service, his posture radiated authority, and his eyes scanned the room with the weight of someone who understood sacrifice better than anyone present. Without saying a word, he walked straight toward the defense, his gaze burning into the judge's smirk as if daring him to continue this farce. The colonel's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the force of a storm rolling through the chamber. Calm, deliberate, and heavy with authority, he addressed not just the judge but the entire courtroom. He reminded everyone of what it meant to wear that sacred uniform, to guard the tomb through night storms, scorching heat, and biting cold, with no complaint, no distraction, and no excuse. He spoke of sacrifice, of men who had stood their ground for generations, keeping their vigil not for recognition but for honor. Every word was a reminder that the soldier standing cuffed before them was not just a man, they were looking at a symbol of unbroken tradition, the embodiment of respect owed to the fallen. The judge tried to interrupt, but his voice faltered under the colonel's unyielding gaze. Even the officers who had placed the cuffs looked ashamed, as if suddenly realizing that their obedience to orders had made them instruments of disgrace. The colonel turned then, facing the guard, and for the first time the silence between them spoke volumes. There was no need for apology, no need for explanation, because both men understood the truth. The guard stood straighter, his dignity still intact, and for a brief moment it seemed as if the chains around his wrists were no more than threads compared to the iron strength of his character. The courtroom, which had been restless before, now held its breath, waiting for the colonel's judgment, a judgment that carried more weight than anything the court could declare. The tension reached its breaking point as the colonel stepped forward, placing himself directly between the judge and the tomb guard, his presence alone a shield stronger than any legal defense. He declared in unwavering tones that cuffing a tomb guard was not merely an insult to one man but to the entire history of service, to the nation's promise of honor, and to every soldier who had ever fallen. His words rolled through the courtroom like thunder, shaking the arrogance from those who thought they held power in this chamber. The spectators who had been silent erupted in murmurs of agreement, some even standing to show respect, while the officers who had shackled the guard shifted uncomfortably, wishing they had refused such an order. The judge, pale now, tried to reassert control with his gavel, but the sound was hollow against the weight of truth spoken by the colonel. With each passing moment, it became clear that the courtroom was no longer his domain. The authority had shifted, belonging to the colonel's presence and to the unshaken dignity of the man still standing in chains. The lesson was unfolding before everyone's eyes. You could mock, cuff, and try to humiliate a soldier of honor, but in the end, respect would rise higher than arrogance. And as the colonel's eyes burned into the judge, the message was undeniable: this was only the beginning, and the lesson had only just begun.